This story involves my former best friend and business partner, Joe, along with his wife. Although Joe and I are still friends, we're not as close as we once were. What happened changed both our lives, and I feel like I'm in a position to share this story. You might think of me as the villain here, and maybe I am, but before you judge, think about how you'd feel in my shoes. Maybe you'd understand my perspective, maybe not. Honestly, I don't really care either way. Joe and I grew up together in the Midwest. He's a genuinely good guy, kind, never one to wrong anyone, an introvert, a bit geeky, but really smart. We were complete opposites in terms of personality, but we got along perfectly. We were the same age and shared a love for video games. I was in ROTC in high school and eventually joined the military after graduation. Joe wanted to join too, but his father didn't approve. This was during the Middle East military intervention, when the media and politicians were all pushing for the conflict. His father was against the military actions, and I understand that perspective. Many of my friends lost their lives over there. Joe could have been one of them, but it didn't end well for him, and now he's serving a 20-plus-year sentence in prison. I guess for him, it's a choice between dying in a foreign country or spending time behind bars in the US, all because of a woman. I've often wondered if I could have done something to change the course of events. Maybe I could have stopped him from getting too involved with his now wife when he first told me about her, back when I was nearing the end of my military service. I often wonder if I'm partly responsible because I was too scared to be honest with him. I still carry secrets that I've never shared with Joe, and I know he would be devastated if he ever found out. After 8 years of service, I was honorably discharged, with most of my time spent in the Middle East. A few days after I got home, I called Joe, hoping to meet up for a drink at the bar. He's now a busy man and had already turned me down once. It had become harder to get him to spend time with me, with his busy schedule running his own business. We'd catch up from time to time, whenever I was on leave, but we were drifting apart as Joe had built a successful manufacturing company. It seems that not joining the military worked out for him. He went on to graduate college with a bioengineering degree and, in less than 4 years, turned his business into a 7-figure company. As for me, I spent 8 years in the military, and now that I'm out, I'm jobless with no real skills to land a high-paying job. I felt like I was starting from scratch. I wasn't surprised by Joe's success. He's always been the smart one, the one who always had all the answers. I reached out to him hoping he would hire me. We had talked about it years earlier when he first started his business. I thought I could help with customer relations and sourcing parts overseas, something I knew he needed, as he was frequently traveling to Asia to source suppliers for components. That day, I met him at the bar, hoping he would show up this time. He had canceled before. As I parked, I saw his car right behind mine. His business was already thriving, and he was driving his dream sports car, though I'll keep that detail anonymous. I was excited to see him. Haven't seen him in 2 years. He had gained about 40 pounds since I last saw him. We exchanged pleasantries as we walked inside. Joe's not a big drinker or into bar hopping, but over the years, meeting at bars had become my habit. While we were talking, I tried to bring up the idea of working for him, like we discussed years ago, but he kept steering the conversation in another direction. He was more interested in talking about his Chinese wife, whom he'd met in China. He had brought her to the US on a spousal visa, and they now owned the business together. He explained that they'd had a court wedding in China, but now that she was in the States, she wanted the traditional white wedding she'd dreamed of since she was a little girl. Joe told me he met her 2 years ago while traveling in China to find suppliers for a new product he was designing. She had been his translator and liaison, and he hired her to work for him while she was still in China. Now, she was responsible for part sourcing and supply chain management, both locally and internationally. Joe has always been the kind of guy who leans toward being a bit nerdy and socially awkward, so whenever a girl shows him any kind of attention, he tends to fall head over heels for her. I've always warned him about it because it rarely ends well. So, when he started seeing this woman, I tried to be cautious, especially since she seemed to be gaining an unusual amount of control over his business in such a short period. Joe even told me they hadn't been intimate because she wanted a white wedding first. And according to her, it had to be special, which meant no physical closeness until after their wedding night. To me, that sounded completely absurd and like a huge red flag. Despite knowing her for 2 years, bringing her to the US, giving her control over critical aspects of his business, and living together for almost a year, he still hadn't had sex with her? Now, I'm not an expert on Chinese culture, but it struck me as very odd for a woman to be so celibate after all he'd done for her. I asked him why they hadn't had the wedding yet, and he told me her parents were facing visa issues, but that they were close to resolving them so she could have the ceremony with her parents present. I didn't buy it for a second. I told him that if it were me, she would have already given up her bee by now, and he didn't take that well. He became defensive. When I questioned what made her so special, Joe started listing off her qualities. She was a great business partner, very smart, beautiful, and hardworking. I told him he should be cautious about giving her so much influence over his company. I reminded him that many Asian women are beautiful and intelligent, and that alone didn't make her exceptional. I also pointed out how strange it was that she hadn't slept with him yet, considering they'd been married for quite some time. At this point, Joe seemed irritated, clearly uncomfortable with me questioning his wife's motives, so I decided to change the subject and focus on why I was actually there. When I brought up the job he had promised me, it felt like I had already annoyed him with my earlier questions. His mood had shifted, and it was clear he didn't want to discuss the opportunity anymore. I couldn't help but feel that the friend I once knew was slipping away. Maybe it was because he now had money and success, but it seemed like he didn't want to hear anything from me anymore. At the end of the meeting, he half-heartedly promised to let me know if there was a spot for me after he shuffled things around. Walking away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy I used to know was gone, replaced by a business-focused version of Joe, caught up in a relationship with a woman he barely knew, being pulled along by her. That night, I made a promise to myself. If he ever did offer me a job, I would just tell him what he wanted to hear, become a yes man, and look out for myself. A few days later, Joe called me and invited me over to his house. I prepared as if I were going to a job interview. I had never been so nervous, meeting up with someone I used to consider my best friend. But now, all I cared about was landing that job. I didn't want to step out of line or say something that would upset him. I knew people change over time and that someone you once called your best friend might become a stranger due to life experiences and changes in their environment. I wasn't sure if I would meet his wife since they lived together, but I arrived at his house around 9 or 10 p.m. His house was nice in a good area of town, but not overly extravagant. At that point, I was still living with my parents and driving a car that wasn't worth much, so his place made a big impression on me. His wife, Kim, was home when I arrived. She seemed shy and formal when greeting me, which made sense. She was very proper and gorgeous, which I figured was probably part of the reason Joe was so taken with her. She'd prepared Chinese food for dinner, and it was delicious. After dinner, the three of us went to the living room to discuss business. We were drinking wine, and as the conversation unfolded, I learned that Joe was offering me the position of VP of Customer Relations and Sourcing. I'd have 2 employees reporting to me, essentially the 3rd highest position in the company, after Kim. He told me more about the business. They had about 10 employees and focused on manufacturing medical equipment, along with components for other industries. They engineered and assembled parts, with most of their materials coming from Asia. The model worked well because they designed the parts, manufacture them in Asia, and then assemble them in the US. It was a very profitable business if you had talented engineers and inventors. Since the customer often relied on them for the life of the part, and they held the patents, they could regulate the prices with little competition. I also realized that Kim was more involved in the business than I expected. She handled much of the supply chain management, customer relations, marketing, and even some hiring, while Joe focused on engineering, quality, and patents. Initially, it seemed I'd be more of a supporting role to Kim than to Joe. Kim spoke excellent English with a slight Chinese accent, and she was incredibly competent and well-connected with both suppliers and customers. She was only 25, just 2 years younger than Joe and me. Joe explained that he was speeding up my hiring because he and Kim were planning a business trip to China and Vietnam in a few months. He wanted me to replace him on the trip so Kim could introduce me to all their suppliers and get me up to speed on that side of the business. Kim made this trip every 2 months, so it seemed like a great opportunity for me to learn and help out. During the meeting, as we drank wine, their personalities seemed to shift. Kim, in particular, started to let her guard down, revealing a more outgoing side when she thought Joe wasn't paying attention. I didn't think much of it, though. If I did, I wasn't about to bring it up, knowing how fiercely Joe protected his relationship with her. About a week after I started, I was already deep into on-the-job training. I had my own office and was learning the ropes. Then, 2 weeks later, There was a manufacturing expo in Las Vegas, and it was a big deal. Several key medical industry clients were attending, so it was a prime opportunity to showcase our products and company. Joe, Kim, one other male employee, and I were all set to attend for the 3-day event, where we had rented a small booth. I was fortunate enough to be invited on this trip because it gave me the chance to learn more about the business, as I would be responsible for advertising our products to potential clients and other expo attendees. The expo was from Wednesday to Friday, so the plan was to fly in on Tuesday and keep our return flight flexible depending on how things went and whether there was more business to explore. We flew into Las Vegas on Tuesday night, and all 4 of us stayed at the same hotel. At first, I didn't expect to have any time to explore the city, since I was focused on reviewing all the marketing and product materials. I had a few questions, so I decided to visit Joe and Kim's suite to ask them for clarification. When I got there, Joe mentioned that Kim had gone downstairs for a quick break. He was looking over some designs, if I remember correctly, but he wasn't able to answer a couple of my questions because they were more related to Kim's side of the business. After talking with Joe, I stepped out of their room and decided to go downstairs to check on Kim. Joe isn't the type of guy to just hang out at a bar for drinks. He's not really into drinking, so if he's there, it's usually for business or meeting up with friends. I figured I'd see if I could find Kim downstairs and maybe catch her for a quick word. When I got to the casino area, I spotted her talking to a guy at the bar. As soon as she saw me, she waved me over. When I approached, I was surprised that they immediately started asking me about a horse racing competition that was on TV. I don't know anything about horse racing, but I could tell they were trying to throw me off track with small talk, possibly because Kim had been caught in a compromising situation. I didn't think there was anything inherently wrong with her talking to someone at the bar. After all, we were in Vegas for business, and maybe she was networking. But the way she acted felt off, like she was trying to cover something up. She was having a drink, and it looked like she and the guy were flirting, though neither of them openly acknowledged it. It left me with a weird vibe, as though they'd been caught in the act. She tried to play it off like we were just talking about some random horse racing, but I could tell something was up. The guy walked away too quickly with that disappointed look on his face. It was like he didn't get what he came for. I shifted my focus to Kim. The question I'd been dying to get clarity on was still on my mind. By the time I sat down, she'd had a couple of drinks, and she was definitely more open than usual. Normally, she was all guarded and careful with her words, but tonight it felt like she was ready to spill. I leaned in, trying to keep the vibe easy, and soon enough, we were talking about her relationship with Joe. I could see her face tighten when she brought him up. "You know, Joe's not the guy everyone thinks he is," she said, her voice a little rough, like she was talking through some kind of frustration. She took a sip of her drink, staring down at it like it had all the answers. "I mean, I love him, don't get me wrong, but the dude's obsessed with work. Everything's about business with him, even me sometimes." I didn't push her to go deeper. I just nodded, letting her talk. The last thing I wanted was to get caught up in their issues. "He's got this whole thing in his head, you know? Like there's a rule book on how people should act, how they should think, what they should wear. It's like you can't win with him. And it's not just me, it's everyone." Her tone got sharper, like she was finally letting herself admit how much it bugged her. "It's always a damn checklist with him. I can never be myself around him, always feel like I'm messing something up." I stayed quiet, just listening. I had learned the hard way to keep my distance when it came to Joe and Kim. I wasn't about to step into the middle of that mess again. "Sounds rough," I said, keeping it casual. Kim just let out a long, tired sigh, like the weight of it all was getting to her. "You know, I never told you much about me, did I?" she asked, looking at me like she was about to drop a truth bomb. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Not really," she chuckled, shaking her head like she was embarrassed. "Yeah, well, here's the deal. I was born in China, only child. My parents, super strict. Old school traditional stuff, you know. But then I had this uncle, my dad's younger brother. Guy was loaded. Took me to the best schools. Made sure I saw the world outside of my little bubble. I got to visit the States a bunch of times as a kid." She paused for a second, a smile on her face like she was remembering something good. "I graduated college early, landed a job working as a liaison for Chinese and foreign businesses. And that's how I met Joe. He was all about networking, and I was the right person to know." I couldn't help but nod, impressed. "You've done a lot." Kim gave a small shrug, but there was pride there. "Yeah, I guess, but it doesn't always feel worth it, you know? Not with Joe." I leaned back, absorbing the shift in her mood. I get it. She met my eyes, her expression softening just a little. Yeah, well, it's not always easy. You think you know someone, but they're nothing like what you expect. I didn't say anything more. Sometimes all you need to do is listen. We talked for over an hour, getting to know each other better. The bar was nearly empty, with most people either at the casino or simply enjoying their own space. We were hitting it off so well, and I'm not sure if it was the booze, but I felt this undeniable chemistry building between us. I tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we invite Joe to join us, but she told me Joe was already asleep. Staying out late wasn't his thing. I knew she was right. I knew it wasn't his scene. But sometimes you ask questions like that when the tension gets too thick, only to regret it afterward. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, needing a break to clear my head. I could feel this intense attraction between us, and it felt inappropriate. It wasn't like she was making moves on me, but we were both flirting a bit, and I might have been the one pushing it more. Maybe I could blame the booze, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable. I needed to step away to calm down because I realized I was about to cross a line I didn't want to. This was Joe's wife, and I wasn't about to jeopardize my job over some fleeting attraction. I wasn't that kind of guy. At least I didn't think I was. When I came back from the bathroom, I saw another guy hitting on her while she sat at the bar. As soon as I approached, he walked off. I sat next to her, and that's when I really noticed how beautiful she was. Stunning, honestly. On a scale from 1 to 10, she was definitely a 9 or 10. As I sat down, I caught myself staring at her, and I immediately tried to play it cool by mentioning the music, asking if she wanted to dance. It was meant to be a joke because the music was terrible, just an elevator song. She laughed, then replied that it was too slow for her taste. I was actually surprised she responded that way, but I went along with it. I asked her what kind of music she liked, and she said R&B, EDM, and house. That's when I blurted out the suggestion of checking out some Vegas clubs that played that kind of music, and to my surprise, she actually knew where to go. She said she'd been there before, for her birthday with a friend, and had visited a few times for business. She seemed to almost boast about it, and in that moment, I started to realize this wasn't the same Kim I thought I knew. I started to get the feeling that Joe wasn't aware of who she really was. She'd been claiming she was waiting for the right moment for things to progress with Joe. But it felt like there was something more going on beneath the surface. I began to think she wasn't as innocent as she let on. She was a clever, attractive woman who loved the attention from men, especially when it wasn't her husband giving it to her. She had a kind of ambition about her that I hadn't seen before. It was clear she wasn't content in her relationship with Joe. All she seemed to do was criticize him, and I got the sense she was using him to get ahead, maybe even planning to carve out her own path while he was just a stepping stone. I followed her lead, and we went to one of those Vegas clubs that played EDM and house music. There was a long line, so we spent time in line just flirting, both of us already feeling the effects of the booze. Once inside, we ended up on the dance floor, getting closer and more physical with each other. Almost too much, honestly. At some point, I got carried away, and she stopped me, saying we should head back before Joe started wondering where she was. It was already around 1 a.m., and she was right. I'd need to be up early, too. We left the club and waited for a taxi. I paid the guy $20 to get us to the front of the line, and during the short ride to the hotel, we started kissing in the back of the cab. Before I knew it, she unzipped and started pleasuring me with the mouth, not even caring that the driver could see us through the rearview mirror. When we were just a few blocks from the hotel, the driver joked that we should get a room, and she pulled away at that. The cab dropped us off, and we headed to the elevator together. We were staying on the same floor, and I thought for sure we'd continue what had started in the taxi. But when we got off the elevator, she simply wished me goodnight and went to the room she shared with her husband. I stayed up late that night, replaying everything in my mind, wondering what might have happened if things had gone differently. The next morning, I was woken by a knock at the door. It was one of my colleagues who had come with us, reminding me that we were supposed to get up early to start setting up our booth before the expo attendees arrived. The plan was to be there by 7 a.m., but by the time I got moving, it was already past that. I quickly got ready, brushed my teeth, and headed downstairs. I didn't really think about the previous night's events until I saw Joe and Kim downstairs having breakfast. I wasn't sure how Kim would act when she saw me, but she greeted me like nothing had happened. We didn't have time to join them, so we told them we were heading to the venue to get everything set up. Once at the venue, we unpacked and prepared the booth. There were only a few visitors and potential customers, so I was busy marketing our products. I kept glancing at Kim whenever I could, but she wouldn't even look at me or speak to me. It felt really awkward. She seemed to be avoiding eye contact, as if she regretted what happened the night before. I couldn't help but wonder if the booze had played a part in her actions. Maybe she'd had a bit too much, made a mistake, and I took advantage of it. By the end of the day, I was sure she was going to come clean to Joe. She was clearly avoiding me, and I was terrified she was going to tell him what happened, which would not only cost me my job, but also a friend. Things got even more uncomfortable when she left before the expo ended. Joe mentioned she wasn't feeling well, so she had to leave early. I suspected part of the reason she left was that I was making her uncomfortable. I felt a wave of guilt as I shared a cab with Joe after the expo. I regretted putting myself in that situation, and I took full responsibility for what had happened. On the ride back to the hotel, I considered telling Joe what had occurred, wanting to get ahead of the situation. But the idea of explaining how his wife had ended up doing what she did was too much. So, I kept quiet. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. It wasn't just physical. I was genuinely worried she might tell Joe and that I'd lose everything: my job, my reputation, and my peace of mind. I felt like I was on the verge of a major disaster. I needed to talk to her, but I felt like everything was hanging by a thread. I couldn't wait until the next day. I went downstairs to the bar, hoping she'd be there like the night before, but she wasn't. The evening felt long and pointless. The next day at the expo, things were quiet for a moment. Joe was out meeting with a client and the other employee was elsewhere, leaving just me and Kim alone at the booth with no visitors around. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to speak with her, but I didn't know how to start. I called her over, and as she looked at me, waiting for me to say something, I started stammering. She gave me this look like, "What's wrong with you?" Eventually, I managed to say, "I'm sorry for what happened the other day," and she replied, "I know. It won't happen again." She didn't seem bothered, but she didn't offer much else. She looked away and went back to what she was doing, as if the whole thing had never happened. It was like that night had just blurred out of her mind. The tension finally broke when a visitor walked into the booth, asking questions about our product. I left that day feeling somewhat relieved. Her response when we were alone was so flat that it made me think someone who had done what she did would have more to say. That night, I felt a little better than the day before, and I slept peacefully. The next morning, the last day of the expo, was supposed to be a half day, with a few meetings lined up with potential customers. I spent most of the day helping the other employee get the products packed and ready for shipping. Joe and Kim stopped by a couple of times, but their day was mostly filled with private meetings. I had normal interactions with Kim. No awkwardness. It was like nothing had happened between us 2 days ago. At the end of the day, we all shared a ride to the airport. I sat in the front seat while Joe, Kim, and the other employee were in the back. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Joe and Kim laughing and chatting with each other. It felt like I had dodged a bullet. I was relieved things hadn't gotten more out of hand with Kim. The trip to China got postponed for reasons I didn't remember. However, I did know that Joe and Kim had planned a white wedding, which Kim had always dreamed of. Her parents had already come from China, and many of Joe's employees attended the wedding as well. By this time, I wasn't hanging out with Joe much anymore, and our relationship had shifted to more of an employee-boss dynamic. I was making more money than I could have ever imagined, and based on the company's performance, I projected that my income would double in less than a year. During that period, we also hired 6 new salaried employees. The company now had 3 managers, myself and 2 others, 3 engineers, and 21 hourly workers. The next month, Kim and I were scheduled to travel to China together. She wanted to introduce me to more suppliers and help me find a vendor for the components we needed for our upcoming product launch. As I prepared for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something could happen between us. We were seated next to each other in business class, staying in the same hotel, and traveling to 2 cities for work. Afterward, she planned to head to the western part of China to visit her family, while I would return to the States. At that point in my life, things were going well. I was financially stable, saving for a house, and in a serious relationship. Even though I found Kim attractive, I hoped that nothing would happen between us. If she made a move, I wasn't sure I could resist. Throughout the long flight, we mostly discussed business, and the conversation stayed friendly with no hint of anything inappropriate. There was one moment, though, that stood out. She asked me a hypothetical question about whether I saw her as a strong leader and if I would join her if she ever decided to start her own company. I said, of course. But inside, I was puzzled. Why would she want to start her own business when she was already a major partner in her husband's successful company? They had just gotten married, so there were no apparent issues in their marriage. That question seemed odd at the time, but years later, it would make sense. The rest of the week in China was productive. We focused on networking, forming new business relationships, and scouting vendors for new products. We stayed in the same hotel for 2 days in one city, then 1 day in another city before Kim left to visit her family in the West. I didn't spend time sightseeing or exploring since that wasn't my thing. Instead, I stayed on the phone with customers back home or worked on my laptop, making sure everything back in the States was running smoothly. After a week in China, I felt confident in my role. I saw myself as an international businessman and product marketer, positions I hadn't trained for, but that Joe had given me the chance to take on. After the trip, it was clear that the brief flirtation with Kim was just that, a short-lived affair. I was relieved it hadn't continued, and from that point on, our relationship remained strictly professional. A few months later, I got engaged to my girlfriend, and we married not long after. Things were going well financially. To put it in numbers, I was making almost $120K a year after my first year at the company. Around the same time, Kim became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. My wife also gave birth around the same time. Since we were all the same age, married within the same period, and had daughters close in age, Joe and Kim began inviting us to every social event they hosted. They seemed eager to get us to become close friends, and while my wife was interested, I kept my distance. I wanted to focus on work and my family, and I didn't want to get involved in anything that might interfere with my marriage or career. There was something about Kim and Joe's relationship that made me uncomfortable, how she seemed to have so much control over him, and I didn't want to get entangled in any way that could jeopardize everything I had built. Moreover, I didn't want my past affair with her to come to light or risk it continuing. Fast forward 2 years and business was thriving. I was making around $250,000 a year, and we were expecting our second child. One evening, Joe called me and suggested we meet at a bar. I found it odd because we hadn't spent time together outside of work in a while, and Joe wasn't the type to just hang out at a bar unless there was a specific reason. He rarely drank. I was immediately on edge, wondering if my past mistakes had caught up with me. I was convinced he wanted to talk about the affair from 2 years ago. I walked into the bar expecting the worst, thinking maybe he was about to fire me. Though I knew him well enough to guess that if he knew the truth, he'd probably just let me go over the phone. Still, I worried he might be handling things differently. Perhaps I was overthinking it, but the unease stuck with me. I walked into the bar, my stomach in knots. Nerves were eating at me, but when I saw Joe sitting there, it didn't take long for him to start talking. He wasn't looking at me like he was about to throw down some advice or get my opinion on something. No, this was different. He was venting. "Man, you don't even know," Joe started, his hands tight around his glass. He looked more frustrated than I'd ever seen him. "Kim and I? We're barely hanging on at this point. It's like everything's just falling apart, and I can't even talk to anyone about it. It's like she's got me in this box." I didn't say anything at first, just let him get it out. We weren't close like we used to be, but this was still Joe. I could tell something was really eating at him. He took a deep breath, then continued. "The thing is, it's not just Kim and me. I've been dealing with family problems. A lot of them. And Kim? She doesn't get it. She's been trying to cut me off from anyone who's close to me. Friends, family, even you, man. I'm telling you, she's got me in a chokehold." I raised an eyebrow, leaning forward just a bit. "Wait, she's doing what?" Joe sighed, wiping his hand across his face like he was tired of repeating the same thing. "She's isolating me, bro. She's pulling me away from everyone. Like, I used to hang out with you all the time, but now, every time I try to make plans, it's like she's got this invisible leash on me." "That's rough, man," I said, just trying to keep it real with him. Joe nodded, his voice dropping lower. "Yeah, it gets worse. Over the years, we've drifted apart. She's always traveling, and I've been doing my own thing, but it's like we don't even know each other anymore. And then her parents, man, her parents came over for the wedding 2 years ago, and they've never left." I blinked, not quite believing it. "Wait, what? They've been living with you?" "Yeah, exactly." He rubbed his temples like he was holding back a headache. It's insane. And now they're trying to tell me how to raise our daughter. It's like they're stepping in on everything, controlling the way we're raising her. It's making everything worse, man. I sat back, thinking about it. That's got to be tough, especially when you're trying to balance all that. Tell me about it, Joe grumbled, looking down at his drink. They don't listen to me at all. And every time I try to step in, they act like I'm some stranger in my own damn house. I'm just trying to raise my kid in a way that makes sense to me, but they keep overriding everything I say. It's like they think they know better. It's like they think I'm the outsider in my own home. That's messed up, man, I said, shaking my head. It's your house, your kid. They gotta respect that. Joe looked up at me, frustration written all over his face. That's what I'm saying. But no matter what I do, I'm always the bad guy. And Kim? She just sits back and lets it happen. It's like I'm invisible to them. I could tell this was eating him alive. There was nothing more I could say that would fix it, but damn, it was hard watching him like this. Sounds like you're really stuck, man. He nodded slowly, his eyes looking distant. I don't know what to do anymore. I listened carefully to everything he said, sensing that he'd been struggling with this for a while without anyone to talk to. I probably was the closest friend he had, but honestly, I didn't feel as close to him as I once did. It must have been difficult for him to open up, especially since I had warned him about this situation years ago. I was furious on his behalf. It seemed so wrong that people were taking advantage of him just because of his passive nature. I wanted to tell him to stand up to his in-laws and kick them out, but he told me that his wife had agreed that her parents would be leaving for China in a few weeks. From the way he spoke, it was obvious that Kim had complete control of their household. He was walking on eggshells in his own home, and it seemed like his in-laws had gained enough confidence to dictate how he should raise his own daughter. I didn't want to push him too hard by telling him he should assert himself as the head of the house, because that wouldn't be the kind of advice he was likely to take. Instead, I asked him how Kim felt about her parents staying in their home for so long and getting involved in raising their daughter. He said Kim supported it and even encouraged it, claiming that her parents' upbringing was what made her the woman she was today. She also argued that because they traveled so much, her parents were the only stable influence in their daughter's life. At the time, I didn't find much wrong with Kim's reasoning based on how Joe explained it. Kim and Joe did travel frequently, sometimes for weeks on end, so it would make sense to have someone steady around for their daughter. But I kept those thoughts to myself. I could tell there was more to the story, so I pressed him further. Eventually, he admitted that they hadn't been intimate for over 4 months unless they were on business trips. She would make excuses, claiming work was too demanding or their daughter needed her attention, always deflecting his advances. He had even suggested that she stay home full-time, but he knew Kim was too driven for that. He expressed frustration over her refusal to have more children. All he wanted was a simple life with a wife who would stay home and raise their family. He said they had more than enough money, but she still seemed to crave more control over his business. I asked him if he'd considered divorce, suggesting that it might give him the opportunity to share custody of their daughter and spend more time with her without outside interference. Plus, it would help protect his finances, as whoever files for divorce first often gets the upper hand. He told me he hadn't thought about divorce and was instead considering marriage counseling. I didn't discourage him from counseling, but I did tell him he should have a backup plan. I also warned him to stay vigilant about Kim's actions. I suggested that he find a way to monitor her phone, track her movements, and maybe even put a GPS in her car to ensure she was where she said she was. When I said this, he gave me a look as if I had just spoken in another language. His expression was one of disbelief, as if he couldn't even imagine such a thing. He brushed off my suggestion, insisting that most of her trips were international and that she was not the type to cheat. In that moment, I realized he was in denial. I felt like I should remain quiet to avoid getting myself involved further. So I just sat there, listening to his stories, not offering any strong opinions, only telling him what he wanted to hear. In my mind, though, I was thinking that Kim was either having an affair or planning to divorce him. This poor guy seemed so blind to what was happening right under his nose. I felt sorry for him, but I also knew I needed to prepare myself for what might come next. Whether or not Joe's marriage fell apart, I couldn't afford to be caught off guard. I knew that if things went south, I might have to make my own exit strategy. I wasn't sure where else I could make the kind of money I was earning now, and replicating his business model to start my own venture seemed like the only option. I had suspected for a while that Kim was trying to take control of the business. She had said a few things in the past that raised red flags, and she had taken over the hiring process. She was bringing in people who were very loyal to her, especially Chinese employees, which seemed odd. I didn't have all the details, but it was clear she was positioning herself for more influence. She even controlled the employees who worked under me, because she had hired them. I couldn't make any decisions without them reporting back to her, which made it impossible for me to get anything done. I didn't trust those employees, and the workplace became increasingly toxic. I tried to assert some control over the team under me, but she fought me every step of the way, and I had to back down to avoid being fired. After talking to Joe at the bar, I began to notice that he seemed to be losing his drive and was falling behind on his duties. On the plus side, the business model they had built was strong enough to run on its own, supported by their existing customer base, which was sufficient to keep things profitable. However, without any new customer acquisition or product development, the company wasn't going to grow. A few days later, I realized that Kim wasn't showing up to work like she used to, and she wasn't responding to my calls, even when I tried reaching her on WhatsApp. A couple of days later, crap hit the fan. Our suppliers overseas started dragging their feet. Calls weren't getting returned, emails were ignored, and it was obvious that something was wrong. I also noticed we were losing customers, and it was too clear to ignore. Something was happening, and it wasn't good. After 5 straight days of Kim not showing up to work, Joe called me and 3 other managers into his office. He had that look on his face, like he knew he had to drop a bomb on us. And when he started talking, I could tell this wasn't just some business hiccup. "Listen up," Joe said, his voice cold. "Kim and I had a fight, all right? And now she's trying to destroy everything we've built. The suppliers we have, some of them are loyal to her, and so are some of our customers. She's been working behind my back to start her own damn business, and she's been trying to ruin us. I need you guys to understand the fallout from this is going to be freaking massive." We all looked at each other like we weren't sure if we heard him right. Joe wasn't the type to make crap up. His eyes were hard, like he was already bracing for the worst. "Get ready," he continued. "We may have to let half the staff go. Crap gonna get ugly, and you need to be prepared. I'm sending you to China and Vietnam next week." He pointed at me. "You'll secure new suppliers. Make sure we don't fall apart while we figure out how deep this crap goes." I nodded, but I was still processing what he was saying. After the other 2 managers left the room, it was just me and Joe. He looked like he was about to crack, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You were right all along," Joe said, finally breaking the silence. He sounded drained, like the fight was already over. "I should have listened to you sooner. I didn't want to believe it, but everything's coming apart now, and it's all on me." He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair like he didn't know where to go from here. I started thinking about that night at the bar, man. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I put a tracker on Kim's phone. I know, it screwed up, but I had to know what was really going on. I leaned in, eyes narrowing. "What the hell did you find?" Joe looked at me, his jaw tight, and he dropped the bomb. "She's been seeing other guys, man, multiple guys. She's been talking to them on WeChat, and one of them actually proposed to her. He's older than me, has more connections in China, and guess what? They're planning to move in together. She's gonna marry this dude and start her own business, a business that'll screw ours up completely." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She's really gonna leave you for some other dude?" I asked, my voice low. Joe's face twisted with anger and disbelief. "Yeah, she's been talking to him for a long time. Even before she met me, I had no idea. And you know the worst part? She told him that she planned to divorce me and take over the company. She's got it all planned out. I just don't know how the hell she thought she could pull it off." I didn't know what to say. The room felt cold, like we were talking about the end of everything. "So what now?" I asked, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. Joe stared at me, his face a mix of rage and heartbreak. "Now? Now we fight. I'm not going down without a goddamn fight, but I'm telling you right now, I'm gonna need you to back me up. Get us those suppliers, and whatever happens, we need to keep this business alive." I nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. "You got it, man." Joe wasn't the same guy I knew anymore, but I couldn't blame him. The betrayal ran deep, and it was clear. This was just the beginning of the shitstorm. Kim had planned to divorce Joe in about 5 months, but her plan unraveled sooner than expected when Joe discovered the truth and confronted her. This forced her to act prematurely. Afterward, she stopped coming to work, and it became clear that most of her trips weren't just for business. They were also romantic getaways. Before Joe uncovered her affair, she had promised him that she would go to marriage counseling and encouraged him to seek individual therapy, all while already making up her mind to divorce him. She was just buying time. Joe confided in me that he had been feeling extremely depressed, even contemplating ending his life in the days leading up to our conversation. At one point, he broke down in tears, and I hugged him to comfort him. It seemed like all the emotion had been building up for a long time. I asked about his daughter and if his in-laws were still staying with him. He told me that the in-laws were gone and that he had hired a babysitter for his daughter. As for Kim, she had gone missing since their confrontation. Joe explained that he had tried calling her several times, but she didn't respond. He found out that she had been contacting his suppliers and customers, urging them to sever ties with his business and sending them incriminating documents to destroy his reputation. Some customers were loyal enough to call Joe and inform him about her actions, while others, driven by money, simply followed the payment trail, allowing her plan to backfire. At that point, I started piecing things together. I suspected Kim had left Joe and their daughter to be with her boyfriend or fiancé in China. She had also been trying to steal parts of Joe's business, but with little success. She had already sabotaged some of his suppliers in China and Vietnam, so it seemed like only a matter of time before we would start running short on critical components, leading to customer complaints about late deliveries. Having traveled to China and Vietnam numerous times, I'd built a network and knew the terrain well. I'd even looked into sourcing suppliers in South America, though with limited success. We were preparing for a one-way trip to China, knowing we had about a month's worth of supply left for some critical parts that Kim had successfully sabotaged. The trip was booked without knowing when we'd return, depending on whether we could secure alternative suppliers. I didn't waste time pondering why Kim would want to destroy the business she had helped build. It became clear to me that she was trying to silence Joe and take control of the business, though he hadn't realized it until it was too late. Now we were scrambling to keep things afloat. I was still trying to make sense of her actions. It seemed more logical for her to take over the business rather than try to start fresh with someone else. Even though Joe was more successful, perhaps she had acted impulsively and her poorly thought out plan was bound to fail. I didn't know if there was more to the story that I didn't understand, but based on what I knew, it seemed like her motives were driven by a desire for control. At this point, I was solely focused on saving the business so I could continue supporting my family and maintaining the lifestyle we had become accustomed to. I saw Kim as the enemy, someone who didn't consider the livelihoods of the 37 employees who depended on Joe's business. We spent about 2 weeks in East Asia, visiting 3 countries. By the end of our trip, we had managed to recover some of our lost supplies. Strangely, Kim had stopped calling the suppliers and wasn't fulfilling her commitments. In the end, money talks, and we offered to pay to keep things moving. It was surprising how abruptly she had stopped her efforts to destroy the company, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever caused her to halt was beneficial to us. After returning to the States, it took us about a month to weather the storm, but eventually things returned to normal. We never heard from Kim again, and I didn't see her during that time. Joe was different, though. While he was already introverted, he became even more withdrawn, paranoid, and defensive. One day, I asked him if he had heard anything about Kim, and he told me that she had abandoned him and their daughter, and he hadn't heard from her since. When I asked why he was asking, his tone was strange, considering everything we had been through over the past few months. A few weeks after Joe's conversation at the bar, I was informed by one of our employees that a missing persons report had been filed for Kim. Her family had claimed that they hadn't heard from her in weeks and had no idea where she was. I immediately called Joe and he confirmed the news. He told me that the police had spoken to him and were considering foul play as a possibility. There was no evidence that Kim had returned to China, and since Joe was the last person to see her, he became the primary suspect. Joe told me he hadn't disclosed her affair to the police because he feared they would use it as motive to arrest him. He specifically asked me not to mention it either. At that point, I had no reason to suspect Joe was involved, and I didn't want to believe it even if it was true. I was willing to cover for him, as I figured it was better for Kim to stay missing than return and destroy my life. 3 months after her disappearance, I noticed a shift in Joe's behavior. He became more social, calling me often, wanting to go out. The business was recovering, and I had made several trips to East Asia. I encouraged Joe to join me more often, out with my family or out with my military friends, hoping he would loosen up and maybe meet someone new. During these outings, I avoided bringing up Kim. She was no longer part of the conversation. One night, while hanging out, Joe shared with me that Kim's parents and her wealthy uncle had been contacting the police, trying to get them to arrest him, as they suspected he was involved in her disappearance. However, there was no evidence of any crime, and Joe had voluntarily allowed the police to search his home, which they did thoroughly. He had told them everything he knew, except for the affair. From the outside, there had been no signs of marital problems. None of them had consulted a divorce lawyer before her disappearance. What was especially strange was that Kim had taken out a large life insurance policy on Joe without his knowledge, adding to the confusion of the case. From the police's perspective, there seemed to be no clear motive for Joe to injure his wife. The police likely questioned the other two managers in the company as they spoke with me, too. They were fishing for information, but since we weren't volunteering anything, it was clear they didn't have much to go on. If they'd found out about Kim's attempts to sabotage the business, they would have had a much stronger case against Joe, but nothing was mentioned to me. The case went cold for about 5 months until Kim's family hired a private investigation team to look into her disappearance. The investigators managed to get some of Kim's former Chinese employees to talk about how she had tried to persuade them to leave the company. Some of her friends also revealed that she had been unhappy in her marriage and had wanted to leave Joe. The private investigators gathered enough evidence to attract the attention of a local newspaper, which, with likely financial backing from Kim's family, began running constant reports about her case, pressuring the police to take action. Eventually, the police obtained some of the private investigation team's findings, including details on Kim's travels, her purchases, and interviews with people involved in her affair. Some employees were brought in for questioning, which applied additional pressure. It was then that the investigators discovered that just before her disappearance, Joe had informed me and the two managers about Kim's efforts to ruin the company, and I was instructed to go to China to fix the damage. When I was called in for questioning, I brought a lawyer with me and refused to cooperate with the investigation. I didn't want to risk incriminating myself. The police insisted that they needed a statement from me since I was close to Joe and Kim. They tried to intimidate me, even suggesting that I was guilty because I had hired a lawyer. Though I had suspicions that Joe might have been involved in Kim's disappearance, I chose not to believe it. Eventually, the police gave up on getting a statement from me, but tried to undermine me by arresting me and releasing me within 24 hours, showing up at my workplace, and other tactics. The police eventually managed to get a warrant to search Joe's house again, where they confiscated several items. Missing person posters of Kim, with the assumption that she was dead, were plastered all over town, offering a reward for information leading to an arrest. The investigation dragged on for another 6 months, and it became a nightmare. The media, likely influenced by Kim's family, was constantly maltreating us at work, trying to get a statement. This took a toll on the employees, and we started losing people. After about 6 months, things started to calm down, but the strain was undeniable. During that time, I kept in touch with Joe. We hung out more often, and there was a strange understanding between us, an unspoken recognition that I knew something about Kim's disappearance, and he knew I knew. Neither of us needed to bring it up. It was a tense silence, but we both carried the weight of the situation. Whatever transpired between them, I told myself to sleep at night by focusing on the fact that Kim was trying to take food off my family's table. She was attempting to destroy a business I had poured my heart and soul into, and she got exactly what she deserved. After 6 months, the district attorney decided not to move forward with the case. All they had were circumstantial evidence and hearsay, and they felt there was a slim chance of getting an indictment from a grand jury. If the case went to trial, Joe might be acquitted, and if new evidence came to light, the case could fall apart completely. So they decided to wait for more concrete evidence, which led to the case being placed in the cold case file for the time being. As time passed, things started to improve at the company. It seemed like we had weathered the worst of the storm. About a year later, while I was at the airport preparing to board a flight overseas, my wife called me. She told me to turn on the local news. I reminded her that I was at the airport and only CNN was available on the TV. She then filled me in, saying that 2 weeks prior, a jogger had found human remains scattered across an area, likely disturbed by animals. Among the remains, they discovered a skull, and the dental records matched Kim's. I immediately canceled my flight and tried calling Joe, but he wasn't answering. Soon after, Joe's lawyer contacted me to let me know that Joe had been arrested. His bail was set at $300,000, and we worked quickly to get him released as soon as the judge permitted. Long story short, I finally got a chance to talk to Joe. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes red and tired. When I asked him what happened, he just stared at the ground for a long time before finally speaking. "It was an accident, man, a freaking accident," Joe said, his voice raw, like he was still trying to process it. "She said she was leaving me, told me she was taking our daughter and heading to China. I wasn't having that crap, man. I didn't want her to take her, so I told her no. She freaked out and I pushed her, not hard, but she lost her balance and hit her head on the wall. She just collapsed right there." I could barely take in what he was saying. "Jesus, Joe, you pushed her?" He looked up at me, guilt written all over his face. "Yeah, man, I didn't mean to, but she just wouldn't stop. She kept yelling at me, saying she was taking my daughter and leaving for good. I was done hearing it, so I snapped. I pushed her and she hit the wall. I didn't think it'd go down like that." Joe paused, swallowing hard. "I panicked. She was on the floor, barely moving, but still talking. It wasn't loud, just like she was in a daze, you know? She was telling me over and over that she was going to take our daughter and leave. I didn't know what the hell to do, man. I thought she'd be okay by the morning." He rubbed his face, eyes heavy. "I helped her to the couch. She wouldn't go to the bedroom. I even brought her a blanket, covered her up, told her to sleep it off. She was still talking, but it wasn't making sense, man. I thought about taking her to the hospital, but then I got scared. I didn't want the cops involved. I didn't want anyone to know what happened." I could feel the weight of what he was saying. My gut twisted. "So what happened the next morning?" I asked, not sure I was ready to hear it. Joe looked at me, his face completely blank now, like he was in shock. "I came back in the living room to check on her, thought she'd be fine. But when I got in there, man, she was gone. Just gone. She was laying there, and the back of her head, there was blood oozing out. She was already cold. I didn't know what the hell to do. I didn't know what to say." The room felt heavier with every word Joe spoke, like the air itself was suffocating. Screw Joe. This is a nightmare. Joe's account aligned with the coroner's report, which showed a small fracture on the back of Kim's skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. The coroner stated that it was unclear whether the injury alone could have caused her pass away, but it was possible that she bled out. After the trial, Joe was convicted of second-degree homicide, and the jury recommended a sentence of over 20 years in prison. He had already served 3 months of his sentence, and we are currently working on appealing the case. Joe had transferred most of his business to me, and I promised to ensure his financial security. Meanwhile, I'm in the midst of a custody battle with Kim's parents, as we're seeking to adopt their 5-year-old daughter, as that's what Joe had wanted. The little girl has grown up with my own children, and I believe my home would be a wonderful place for her.